Hey guys, Captain John Konrad here, CEO and founder of G Captain. Today's most important story is, of course, the Yankees making it to the World Series. But the second most important story of the day is the Mississippi River drying up. So, this article over at G Captain, I want to remind you on the right here to get these daily news stories into your mailbox every morning. Enter your email here and you will get our free newsletter. Starting off, the Mississippi River is drying up again, and the timing could not be worse. The Mississippi River is suffering from low waters for the third straight autumn, a crucial time of year when American farmers on the route to deliver their crops to the world. Months of limited rainfall with few chances for more during the rest of the season have left the vital waterway so shallow that barges are starting to run aground, even after shippers started running lighter loads to prevent boats from hitting the river bottom. So just pausing here for a second, the Mississippi River is there. It will always be there. That is our editor-in-chief, Mike Schuler, calling. I'm going to have to put him on pause, but go to Twitter and follow Mike Schuler and, of course, G Captain. But the Mississippi River is running dry, which means that the water levels are lower. These water levels, the draft of the barges, how deep they sit in the water is highly dependent on the level of the water in the Mississippi River. The Army Corps of Engineers, at least north of St. Louis, tries to maintain 9 feet of depth, but it depends on the availability of dredges, those barges and ships that dig mud out from the bottom, and water levels. So you can either have more dredges and more engineering or more rainfall to increase the water levels. Why is this important? Because the deeper the water, the deeper the barges can sit on the water, which means you can put more grain and other materials inside these barges if the water level is higher. So continuing, while the situation isn't as chaotic as in past years, the lack of water is again creating headaches for shippers and farmers. The drying of the Mississippi over the past 3 years is raising shipping costs and hindering farmers' ability to compete for markets overseas. During the best of times, nearly 2/3 of U.S. crop exports are shipped on the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. We pause again. One of the reasons the United States is the biggest exporter is because our costs are low. We have one of the best farmlands, the Midwest, in the world, if not the best. Ukraine is arguably number 2, but under worse scenarios right now. But it's not just the topsoil in the Midwest and the drainage and the water. Those are very critically important, but also the low cost of transportation. So if you can move on barge, it's a fraction of the cost of train, which is a fraction of the cost of trucking. So what makes us able to export so well is a combination of the great soil conditions in the Midwest compared to the transportation costs. Something like soybean, the number 2 competitor to the United States is Brazil. Well, Brazil has excellent soil, but a lot of jungle over top, which has to be taken away, burnt off, and that soil has to be restored, often with a lot of additional fertilizer, more than the United States is required. Because it's a little more tropical, you may also need more pesticides and such. But the real difference is, while the Amazon is one of the greatest rivers and a navigable river, in the world. It doesn't go to the farmland areas. That soybeans has to be trucked out, which adds considerably to the cost of agriculture. So transportation is a lost cost. Our farmers are able to kind of pin the market, charge less on an international, because we have this Mississippi River allowing cheaper transportation costs. Now, when the barges can't load as much grain, transportation costs are higher because you need more barges and more delays. Delays is the bigger problem because that grain has to be stored. Storage fees are expensive, and you can get lost. That grain can go bad. It can be eaten by animals. There's a number of things. I'm not a farmer and expert, but the storage costs are considerable. So when you have backup, there's more storage costs, more barge and tugboat costs. And then more of the farmers who want to move that grain in the market will put it on trains or trucks instead, which increase the costs considerably. It's a globally competitive market. So, the farmers are forced to eat some of that transportation costs if they want to stay competitive with other places around the world like Ukraine and Brazil. Continuing, longer periods of low water and increased transportation costs to get bushels to port in the United States ultimately starve off business, said No Bull Inc. grain analyst Susan Stroud. Susan, I love that name, No Bull Inc. Continuing, shipping costs are currently about 55% above the average for the past 5 years. While demand for American soy and corn is strong, those elevated costs could create a competitive disadvantage once farmers in Brazil start harvesting early in. Brazil is South America, so obviously their harvesting season is opposite ours. Continuing for now, because world buyers in countries like China are rushing to import U.S. crops ahead of the November 5th presidential election, shippers are able to pass along the extra costs. U.S. corn at the Gulf of Mexico is priced at about $197 per metric ton, just below prices in the Brazilian port of Santos. World demand has been shifting away from the U.S. for years, partly due to increased domestic processing that keeps more supplies in the country. The river problems are only making a recovery more difficult. Let me pause. Another advantage of the U.S. farmer is in the technology and innovation in the farming, combines and equipment that lasts longer, that's more automated. This all helps increased yields. But what also increase profitability for U.S. farmers is if they don't have to transport the material outside the United States to get processed, to be put in food, to be milled. So there's been a push for reindustrialization back in the United States. But this is an advantage to U.S. farmers if we can keep more of that. They can sell into domestic market for higher prices and potentially lower transportation costs. So this real industrialization is a big piece of the puzzle. Lately, it's been a smaller percentage, but it is growing. Continuing, we are at the mercy of the river, says Bryce Baker, a general manager of the Jersey County Grain Terminal in Hardin, Illinois. Baker started booking barges he needed this month back in August to make sure he wasn't short. So-called draft restrictions, which limit how deep a vessel can sit in the water, mean a barge of corn could have 27% less than a full load. It definitely affects the volume, Baker said. It's really making facilities like mine get longer barge freight. Pausing. So longer barge freight means he's got to book barges in advance. He has to book more barges because you can load less on the barges. Continuing, the problem stems from a dry spell in the regions that feed the Mississippi as well as the Missouri and Ohio rivers. Across the Midwest, nearly 83% of the land is abnormally dry and almost 53% is in drought, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. Pausing again, so when you have lack of rain in the United States, you have lower yields of crop, which drive prices higher. And then if you add additional transportation costs, it can really get that grain and soybean expensive rather quickly. I do want to say one thing, though, is, and I guess it's in the next paragraph. Let me continue. It's so dry that one good rain won't solve the low water problems on the river, said Drew Smith, Deputy Chief of the Watershed Division of the Army Corps of Engineers. Officials aren't ready to blame climate change. The recent trend of dryness was preceded by a lengthy wet period that didn't end until 2020. It's very cyclical. We see it both ways, Smith said. So getting back to the Army Corps of Engineers is in charge of drilling, dredging, making waterways deeper, engineering waterways, how the river turns. The river's always trying to change course and directions. The Army Corps of Engineers builds berms, builds diversion paths, and builds locks into, especially north of St. Louis, the northern Mississippi area. Now, you could go all the way from the Mississippi up to the Great Lakes and through the St. Lawrence Seaway, down the East Coast, into the Gulf of Mexico, up through New Orleans, and back in the Mississippi. Smaller boats can. I think boats usually less than 50 feet. But barges are primarily up and down. And they're also seeing delays in the locks because these locks are getting older. They're huge, they put together large amounts of barges together with one tugboat. And the upper Mississippi, they have to divide that out. They got to break the tow apart into two sections to fit in these old locks. And when one of the locks goes down, there are estimates that it costs the U.S. economy approximately $300 million a day when a lock goes down. Well, the Army Corps of Engineers is underfunded. I believe they have about $1 billion a year to maintain all of this, but there's not a lot of extra money, especially with recent inflation, in order to expand this. You also have the Dredging Act of 1906, something like that, which says that it has to be a U.S. built and flagged dredge that does this dredging. The Army Corps of Engineers has their own dredgers, but it's very expensive to build and maintain dredges in the United States. And the Army has not invested in new dredges in years. Some of its oldest dredge, I believe, is 56 years old. So this is a part of a larger problem. We've also talked on G-Captain about the failure of the Gaza Pier, the JLOTS, Joint Logistics Over the Shore capability. The humanitarian pier they built in Gaza was a failure. There was just a GAO report that we talked about on G-Captain about watercraft being not available. Please go to our very good friend Sal Mercogliano's YouTube channel, What's Going On in Shipping. It's the last video he did. I think he released it on October 24th. 2024, talking about the watercraft crisis, how the Army only has, I think it's 25-30% of the watercraft it needs for a war. These are the craft that move logistics from ships into shores and ports. Army has invested in other things like expeditionary port control. So when the Army takes over a country, it's going to try to take over those ports. Then you need Army guys to run the cranes and the equipment in order to move containers and bring in munitions, fuel, and so forth. The Army has been underfunding all of this, and it's both sides of the aisle. In the Biden administration, there hasn't been an increase in any of this funding, and it's slowly gone down. They have cut pre-positioned ships under the Biden administration. So these are large ships that are overseas with tanks and supplies already there, so that you don't need the small watercraft coming across at the start of the war. Biden has got that. Trump, Secretary Esper and General Milley, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs and Chief of Staff of the Army prior to that, sold a lot of the watercraft off at auction. And then Biden, previous to that, wasn't focused on maritime. The U.S. Maritime Administration is in charge of the ports, charge of development money, getting Wall Street investment money. They never talk about the Mississippi River. They have the Marine Highway Program under MARAD. Go look at it, and they show the economic importance of these waterways and how it lowers costs for not just agriculture, but anything. We're not very good at moving things short sea shipping. So when a big container ship comes into a port, the containers are taken off and put to a warehouse and usually sent on trucks. This is a big reason why our infrastructure is crumbling, those heavy trucks, why traffic is so bad, especially north to south. In Europe, they'll take that and they'll put it on a smaller ship or barge and they'll go to a smaller port. We don't do that very well with containers, but we do a lot of short sea shipping of anything that can move through a pipe. So grain and soybeans, a lot of it can be pushed through a pipe with air. Cement can be pushed through a pipe. Some aggregate can be pushed through a pipe. Coal ground down, it can be either pipe or conveyor. And of course, oil and petroleum products. We're rather good at using this system, and this lowers the cost substantially. It's cheaper than even pipelines. Well, it depends on the scenario, but it's definitely cheaper than trying to move petroleum or these products on train or trucks. Fraction of the cost. Well, that cost goes directly into U.S. businesses. That cost savings. So the $1 billion the Army Corps of Engineers saves, their estimates change, but it's something like $10 back to the economy for every dollar that we spent on these inland rivers and waterways, MARADs, marine highways. There's also a huge reduction in carbon emissions and climate advantages. But MARAD is broken. The FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, has over 40,000 people. The Maritime Administration, MARAD, has less than 800, and only half of them are working on this type of policy. So even if they wanted to expand and grow, they can't. So we have an underinvestment in this, and the Army Corps of Engineers, used to be the premier place where West Point graduates went to. When Douglas MacArthur graduated either at the top of his class or near, he wasn't allowed to go into infantry or cavalry. He was forced to go into the Army Corps of Engineers because that's where the best and the brightest went. Now it's not where people want to be. People want to be on the front line. They want to be in the air cab and helicopters and tanks, electronic warfare. So there isn't this suck of high-level talent, and then they've gotten rid of a lot of the lower levels of the Army Corps of Engineers. They've given it out to contractors on these dredge ships as U.S. merchant mariners who are mostly civilian contractors. When we had the Baltimore Bridge collapse, the Army Corps of Engineers said they are in charge, with Secretary Pete saying he was in charge, even though no one really saw Secretary Pete's involvement, and MARAD didn't play a part. But ostensibly, the Army Corps of Engineers was in charge, and the Army has a huge number of soldiers and engineers and people who can move barges and waterways. They used to have a watercraft division in Baltimore that, again, Esper under Trump got rid of. Well, so they didn't have this equipment, the salvage equipment there. They had to bring in contractors. And then I went down there, and I only saw one Army person. The one Army person was the colonel in charge. She was excellent. But everyone else was contractors, and the actual management of the Baltimore Bridge, the law enforcement, the organization, the people running meetings, setting up equipment, all of that was done by the Coast Guard and Coast Guard Auxiliary. And the Coast Guard has the smallest budget by far of any of the services. So there's a lot of pushback in the maritime community of, hey, Army, come up and do your share. And they're not. They are not interested in this. After 20 years of global war on terror, fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Army has taken money out of the support programs, giving it to contractors, giving a smaller share to contractors, which has been cut off by inflation even further, and put that money into weapons and tanks and electronic warfare. So now when you go to the biggest Navy conference of the year, Sea Air Space in Maryland at the Gaylord Hotel, I went last year and I booked a hotel just days before the conference. And then last week was the big Army conference, and every single hotel room in all of DC was taken up. Massive, enormous, because that's where the money has been flowing. That's where the influence has been flowing. It's been taken out of the maritime and naval services, Navy, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine. It's been taken out of the Air Force and funneled into the Army. Now, if you look at a chart, the Army gets 1/3 of Pentagon spending, the Air Force 1/3, and the Navy 1/3. But the Army does not have large ships. It does not have large bombers. So their percentage is automatically bigger. Yes, they have a lot of people, but neither of the services. Only the Marine Corps has done a financial audit. So we don't see exactly where that money is going. And I'm telling you, it's going into these weapon systems. It's going into studies by McKinsey and Deloitte. It's not going into the dredging that helps the U.S. economy, which would be fine if the future war was a land war. But we know that the next future war is likely going to be in the Pacific, where islands are, where you'll need dredges and salvage equipment that the Army has divested. And if it wasn't so critically important for the economy, and not just the economy, as we look to reshore, we're going to need more oil and coal and energy up to the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is the Rust Belt because it's on the Great Lakes and these river systems. And if we could build all the factories we want, if we don't have the barges and waterways to supply cheap energy and move large amounts of things like coke for steel, it's going to be very hard for those businesses to compete without massive, massive subsidies. So bottom line, the Army is really failing here, and Bloomberg doesn't understand that. The commodities, the agriculture people don't understand how important the Army is and how much the Army is failing. So when you read these, it mentions the Army Corps of Engineers, but no blame is put on the Army. That's why this is a Bloomberg article that they've graciously allowed us to paste here. But if you want to learn more on those Army challenges, you got to read articles by Mike Schuler, myself, or Sal Macagliano on GCaptain, because no one else is covering this. Continuing, it remains to be seen what may be driving the dryness over the last few years, said Trent Ford, the Illinois state climatologist, a position under the University of Illinois. 3 years does not make a trend. So he's very careful in saying that this is not climate change, whether it is or whether it isn't. That is only part of the issue. This is what the Army Corps of Engineers is supposed to engineer for these, dips in the cycle. And now because we don't have this robust engineering, because we're barely maintaining the locks, and the money that we're putting into new locks, like the SO locks up in the Great Lakes, is not going into the river systems, which is critically important to lower cost. Whew, that's a lot. So bottom line is, call your congressman, call people on the next president's transition team, tell them the Army's got to start doing their share. They got to get back in the engineering business, and they can't just contract it out to contractors at the lowest bid. And they can't just put the planning to places like McKinsey and Deloitte, which are charging billions and don't actually move soil and dirt that we need for these barges. This is not a difficult problem. And it's not very expensive. You think $1 billion a year, okay, maybe dredging and fixing the locks. Let's say it costs $10 billion. Let's say it costs $15 billion, the cost of one aircraft carrier. Well, the DoD budget officially is about $850 billion. Unofficially, it's like $1.2 billion. This is a tiny, tiny fraction of that. And the other frustrating thing is we've given the Department of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, we have given him $1.2 trillion in the Infrastructure Act to fix our roads and our trains, our airports, and our rivers. But the slowest percentage of that money by far is going into our rivers, which has the largest economic leverage to help the economy. Hopefully the next administration understands that. We don't need a lot of new money. We just need to be smarter about spending the $1.2 trillion already in DOT and making sure that the Maritime Administration has it, holding the Army accountable for what they're allowed to do, getting smarter people into the Corps of Engineers. The money, the talent, and everything is already there. We just have to leverage it. Again, this is Captain John Konrad with GCaptain. I ask you to subscribe to this newsletter. Go visit GCaptain on Twitter. Visit our friend Sal Mercaliano on What's Going On in Shipping YouTube channel. And you can visit myself. Just type John Konrad with a K in Google. You will see my articles on GCaptain. And go to Twitter, John Konrad, all one word. Konrad with a K on Twitter, where I push some of my new ideas and my frustrations. I really get mad at the Army and some of those tweets. If that's something you're looking for, please subscribe. And go Yankees at the World Series today. I am so excited and wishing you, whether a Yankees fan or not, an excellent weekend. Take care.